Hey Dan, thank you so much for being here on the Education Next podcast. And I have been a big fan of yours personally, following yours and Kai's journey, unschooling, hopping around journey that you do. I love your videos and your approach to unschooling. So tell us about yourself, how you came to this kind of a purposeful sort of a learning system that you have found for yourself, and what brings you into this space.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm kind of excited to talk. And yeah, I've definitely been following a bit of your journey as well. And your son is pretty awesome. Um, for me, it started. It's interesting. I wonder how far to go back, like my childhood, or I think for me, when I was in school, I was always good at school,
Mhm.
right? So I succeeded at school. I did everything great, and then
Mhm.
when I got out of school, and I didn't know what to do next, and college was next because everybody told me college was the right answer, so I did that. And
Mhm.
then college was over, and I didn't know what to do next because nobody was there to tell me anymore. And it was just like, get a job. And the job market at that point was terrible. Um, and so I was popping around, thinking of ideas, and I liked the idea of traveling. In college, I had studied abroad in Samoa, so I really like the Pacific area.
Mhm.
And then I decided on studying, or well, not studying abroad, but I decided on doing going to Japan to teach Japanese students English.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I did that for 2 years, and I really started finding out how much I liked teaching.
Mhm.
Um, and not so much of being like a top-down teacher, but like kind of almost being in a community of kids that were interested to learn.
Mhm.
And so all along my journey and in my next journey where I started thinking about being an actual teacher, like in the States where I needed to become certified,
Mhm.
um, I always met with these times where teachers wanted kids to do things at a specific time in a specific way. No questions now. We got to move on. And it, again, this very like top down type approach. Um, and it really bugged me and it made me kind of reflect on my studenthood
Mhm.
and how I was a good student. So I was never one that got yelled at for being bad or not knowing things.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I didn't enjoy school as much as I thought I did.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, a lot of this reflection bubbled up, and I feel like had I not taken this journey, would have never reflected on my own education. I would have just been like, well, that's school, and everybody's got to go through school. Um, but with my reflection, I just thought more and more how I was bored most of the time and how I was like a people pleaser. I wanted to do what the teachers wanted. And when I got out of school, I didn't have people to please or a path to follow, and it was all myself. And at that point, what's funny is I had to become self-directed, in a way that not a lot of people think that they are. Like I feel like most adults are self-directed, um,
Mhm.
but it's the opposite. Like, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I agree. So, I mean, with you, only after that you come out of that bubble of you're always promoted from one grade to other, so you have that security. Um, but once you are out there and then you do not have any grade to progress to or any grade to fall back to, then you are left, and then it has to be self-direction where how do I, where do I direct myself into what am I going to choose? What are the options available? Then, it starts coming up. Some people are able to handle it beautifully, some people are not. And there is, I think, like you said, most of us become self-directed learners quite late. Yeah.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think basically when you get out of school, you have to kind of learn how to learn again, and
Mhm.
you kind of have to recalibrate and figure things out. And it's almost like you're starting from grade one out of
Mhm.
school. And I feel like when I got to the point where we decided that we were going to unschool my son, um, that was one of the things that really motivated us, was that
Mm,
he would be able to start from himself, and it would be self-directed, and it would be like all of his motivations, what he wanted to accomplish from the start.
mm,
And so when he got to grade 12,
mm,
um, he would be 12 years ahead in that respect, in kind
mm,
of like connection to self, intuition,
mhm,
understanding what he wants and how to regulate, and how to not be bored, how to, find things on his own.
mhm,
Um, and how to get stuff done. And where we started, so like I said, I started student teaching,
mm,
and that did not really feel good, student teaching for me. Um, just being told that, like, hey, we gotta be on this timeline, and you gotta teach kids, and look, those kids aren't paying attention. I'm like, well, I know why they're not paying attention, and I know why this material is tricky, and this curriculum is coming from the top, from somewhere. I don't even know who came up with this idea, and now I gotta push it to these kids that half of them are just like not even understanding what's going on, and want to be outside, or want to do something else, or want to talk. And um so going through that was tricky. And at the same time, my son was about to transition from a preschool, which was really, the curriculum was informed by the children. So whatever the children in the class were interested in, then the teachers designed a curriculum based around that. So it wasn't necessarily self-directed, but it was very progressive. Um, and to think that my son, who was already reading at that point, who I felt like was already like way ahead in a lot of areas, and he was already self-motivated to learn, which I
mm,
think honestly a lot of kids at that age are, um, because he was in kindergarten at that point.
mhm.
And to think that he was going to go into first grade where they were still teaching kids how to read, and my son was reading like 200-page books. And I was like, I don't know, I feel like we're going to be wasting a lot of time. My son's going to become bored, going to become a
Mhm.
problem. And at that same time, I went to the library, and I randomly picked up a book on unschooling. And I
Mm,
picked it up thinking, okay, this is a book about homeschooling, which means it's religious, but at least it's something new that I haven't really looked into about
mm,
education, because I was trying to stay up on education.
mhm,
And I read this book, and I read through it in like a week, and I was sold. I was like, wow, can we make this happen? And so
mhm,
I talked to my wife, I talked to my son, and with kind of everybody's consent, we were all in and jumped on
mm,
board.
mm,
And this was right before the pandemic happened, which was kind of nice
mm,
that we were already doing it when the pandemic started.
mm,
And then I was able to give people a lot of like ideas on like, well,
mm,
what does homeschooling, what does unschooling look like?
mhm,
Um, yeah. And yeah, that's kind of where we started.
mm,
Yeah, it was a fun journey up to that point. And early on, my son came up with this idea that, hey, why don't we were in our car, and we would take lots of long drives to different areas, and we would listen to a lot of podcasts.
mhm,
And one of the podcasts that we listened to um, really inspired us to make our own. So my son was like, hey, why don't we make our own podcast? And I'm
mm,
like, okay, yeah, why not? And so again, as a self-direct, like as a new unschooler myself,
mhm,
I was thinking, okay, well, how do you do a podcast? Is there any free way that I can do this?
mm,
What are our topics? What are we going to discuss? And then we decided to like kind of form it around my son's unschooling,
mm,
that whatever he was interested in, we would both research together and then kind of
mm,
present it on each show,
mm,
on each episode. And what's funny is that early on, so our podcast called Unschooling with Kai, early on,
mm,
I had this feeling that this is really good because it is visible learning. I can show to the world how much my son is learning, and it's proof to me that this unschooling thing works.
mhm,
But then each for us, each year that we did it was a season. So now we're in season 5 at this point. Um,
mm,
and each season we kind of deschooled a bit. We kind of started to understand that like, okay, I don't have to prove that my son is learning.
Mm,
Let's make it more of a conversation.
mm,
Um, and then we're at this point now where my son just asks questions, and
mm,
that's each of the episode, just a question, and we're answering one question. We're not covering this whole huge topic, which might span 4 episodes, 5 episodes, an
mm.
hour each. We're just like, hey, let's dig into these little topics and then get real deep into them. But yeah, just interesting how my deschooling, and I'm not sure uh how well you understand or the audience understands that idea, but how much that kind of shifted our mindset over time.
Mm. I mean, I can relate to it a bit because, when we started our journey, it was very similar. We were from in the traditional school. I was working in the same school. Adi was learning there. But after COVID, as it happened, we started spending more time together. Anyways, even, when we were in school, we had all those weekends where we would do a lot of things at home. And like you said, that shift, initially it's like we wanted to do a lot. We wanted to catch up with all the podcasts. We wanted to pick up all the videos and watch together and learn together and make all these projects. And we have also seen this kind of shifts every time. And then we planned, okay, and it was looking so much in a day, and then it would exhaust us to that limit of how much are we going to learn. It's endless, and the more you learn, you feel like I'm missing this out, I'm missing that out. It was fun. Adi would never say no, I don't want to learn, but it was only getting you know I would want to bring him all the graphical novel experts and give him, why don't you read this guy, why don't you read this guy, and this is the best book, but there are so many. And there is this book and there is this movie, and the more you get into it, it just makes you go crazy. But I think slowly it happened that he started showing, interest in particular things. Like now there are patterns. There are days when he just want to do video games, or there are days when he just wants to spend time making something. And you just cannot pull him out even if you want, because you just keep going back there, and you understand that he's really interested in that. And I've seen days when he has been so focused, he wants to crack some code or something. He can wake up early in the morning and he can just work on that particular sort of a thing. He's building app or something, but I never have to tell him basically that, uh, this is what, this much time. If he's really passionate about something, I always try to guide him that if there's something too much, or there is, how to balance time, or when he is struggling in something, or he feels that he's feeling tired. So I think that's is my role left now. But mostly I think also then it sends me to understand about different kind of entrepreneurs, what they did as in their childhood. I try to create parallels in my brain and see where the learning leads to, what how different people who have achieved different things, how they were learning. So I go into those rabbit holes and try to understand various things. um I think it's very interesting how each parent can, deschool or unschool their own process of how they learned in their early years, and then the kind of role they want to play now. But at least I can say this for sure, that that satisfaction that I get with learning with Adi is different, of helping him out, or providing whatever I can to my capacity. That gives me a lot of joy when I see him. I don't, like you said, reading ability. When he was reading, and if he goes after something, he can just read. You can't stop him. But if he doesn't want to read, you can't make him read.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that resonates with me. I mean, you were talking about rabbit holes, and I feel like that's what our podcast is. It's just this like each episode is just this deep interest where we're like, I have no idea, or I have an idea of what it might be, but we might be 100% wrong. So
Hmm.
let's figure out and dive down this rabbit hole together. And that really helped me kind of connect with my son in a way that I kind of always like to envision that I'm connected with my son if I can see through his eyes. If I can
Mm,
understand what he wants in that moment, what he's thinking about, where he wants to go, that I'm kind of on the same wavelength as him. And I do, as a parent, find myself go from, you know, the work that I do, the separate work that I do, to being in the mode with my son. So it's like the work mode versus like the play mode. And don't get me wrong, I feel like some work for me is play as well.
mhm,
But it's a little bit of a different mindset of like being open and curious about someone else
mm,
versus getting stuff done that you want to get done.
mm,
Um, and shifting back and forth, I'll find myself being present with my son, being there with my son, but not necessarily seeing the world through his eyes. And I'm like, all right, something's up. Maybe the last week I really haven't connected in the way that I want to. And that takes some time to be like, okay, let me slow down and figure this out. Because usually what happens is I'm rushing. I'm like, still
mm,
have my mind in work mode, or I'm still, getting out of work mode, or I'm thinking
mm,
about what's next. I have to cook dinner, or this, or that, or this.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and you were talking about how the parent kind of shifts,
mm,
and that's definitely something I've experienced.
mhm,
And I guess I had a bit of a different role because I started off as a teacher, and I think a lot of the parents that I coach start off as a parent, and then they're striving to become a
mm,
teacher,
mhm,
right? Because they want to know all the things and be able to give that to their children, and that can lead to burnout like pretty
mm,
quick because parents are like, I can't manage all this, I don't know all of this, and I can't set up all the curriculum for this, or I bought the curriculum for this and it's not working because
mm,
my son is not feeling it, and we're just having struggles. We're fighting over it. So it kind of seems like for me, it's like a lot of parents go from parent to teacher, and then in the best case scenario they move on into a place called like facilitator, learning
mm,
facilitator,
mhm,
right? So they're just there to provide resources, to answer questions that they might know or maybe not, and let's look it up together. To strew, have you ever heard of strewing?
mhm,
You probably already do this. So basically you give resources or activities and you just leave them out in
mhm,
a way that, for example, Adi could interact with them. So if you go to the library and you get a couple books,
mm,
and you're like, I think Adi likes this, and maybe this one too. And then here's an interesting graphic novel. And then you just leave them there.
mm,
And it's okay if he doesn't read any of them,
mm,
or he just flips through one of them, or he reads all of them. And it's just like um, it's just kind of like an invitation.
mm,
And so it's just the
mm,
possibility of things to do. And
mm,
you can do this not just with books, but you can do this with activities like, hey, I'm going to leave an art set out today. Or I know my son was talking about this maze that he wanted to make. So let's leave those materials out today. Or he was going to make something out of cardboard. So I'm
mm,
going to leave out scissors. And so, again, just kind of invitations.
mhm,
Um, and then I also see that we're saying parent and then teacher and then learning facilitator. And I think after that, where you're like, well, learning isn't the goal because learning's going to happen.
mhm,
Then you just become a life facilitator. You're
mm,
just like,
mhm.
how can I help you in life?
Correct,
And
correct.
it's
Mm,
definitely each step is like
mhm, mhm.
each step is progress. And even the parent to teacher is a bit of progress, even though it seems a little backwards at times. It's almost a necessary step along that path.
Mm, I totally relate to a lot of things that you said now. I mean, it's more like, now we have come to a stage where it's more like I really have to learn or about, what would be the benefits of, why don't we try in a different way? Because he likes to do a lot of projects these days. He wants to keep his days quite packed, and he works like an entrepreneur already. He has this. He batches his time. He wants to be organized. He wants to wake up early. He wants to, sleep on time. And these are a couple of shifts that has happened couple of months back. And it helps me as well because now both of us can be more organized with our work. we are reflecting to each other, because it feels like I'm working with someone and we are figuring out, what has worked, what has not worked. And we leave this conversation, we watch these videos where people are talking about productivity. So now this is our season of productivity. We try to get talking about why this thing did not work, why this system did not work. And it's fun because it's just like I think it's exploration. We are sort of exploring what would be our best days would look like, or is it something that is even possible to create a best day, or where I feel satisfied that I did such and such thing. And like you said, it moves away from learning, it moves beyond, it becomes more of a life skill sort of a arrangement now that I see. Have you been coaching a lot of parents, and would you like to share something about it?
Sure. I guess I coach kind of in seasons in a way. What my coaching started off because again, I had started unschooling at a point where just down the line, a lot of people were going to start homeschooling. So I was helping people transition to homeschool, but at the same time, I was saying, following the science, I would recommend this, right? Because at the same time I was doing my teacher certification, I was also getting a master's in early childhood education. And I'm that was one of my struggles in the classroom was that all of the science that I was reading about was not happening in the classroom. You
Mm,
know, the science says like, let's individualize for children and let's make learning meaningful and let's do it hands-on. And none of that is happening in the classroom.
mm,
None of like learning for the most part is not meaningful. And there might be little bits here and there where a child's like, that's interesting. But again, often it gets shuffled along, the bell rings, you got to move to the next class or the next subject. And it's just it's broken up and siloed in a way that's doesn't
mm,
make any sense for our minds, especially for young learners. So I think for me, I was trying to help people transition to homeschooling. I was trying to show examples of how that could work. And at the same time, I was saying, also, I see that you're kind of curriculum heavy and worksheet heavy, and you're telling me that's a little bit of a struggle. Here's a couple of the reasons why that might be true. And have you thought about like a little bit more of self-directed learning?
mm,
And I never see self-directed learning or unschooling as this hard category. I
mhm,
see it as a spectrum. So
mm,
I even think that people are homeschooled that start homeschooling could even have their foot in the door
mm,
of like unschooling.
mm,
Um, and I think it's a little harmful to say like unschooling is a very specific defined category because then what you're doing is you're gatekeeping and you're kind of pushing people away from it. Whereas I think a lot of the science points to self-directed learning and unschooling. And
mm,
if we could open that category and say, hey, maybe specific unschooling or radical unschooling or however you want to imagine it doesn't work for every family. So let's broaden the category and try to imagine how those principles, again, the science,
mm,
can work for a broader range of families. And one thing where this really makes sense is when we're talking about like neurodiversity. Like neurodivergent children aren't necessarily going to be the ones like Adi who are so regimented, they know what they're doing, and then they can accomplish that. They're not going to have all the executive function to make that work well.
mm,
But it's still beautiful to see what they're doing. And it's just a couple extra steps for the parents to think about like, how do I keep this organized? How do I keep this in line?
mm,
And I know my child has this that they're interested in. So how do I help them get to there?
mm,
Um, and I think deschooling is a big part of that too, because if you're thinking about school, if you're coming out of school, especially if you were a teacher, you feel like, all right, they're in second grade, so they should know this to this, and I'm judging them against the other second graders that I know, and they're not interested in this, and their math is not up to par. But then if you think about all the things that they are accomplishing, what the deep dives and the rabbit holes that they've been down and what they've actually meaningfully learned, it gives you a little bit of pause and you're like, well, maybe it doesn't have to be so regimented as school lays it out. And so that's a lot of the work that I do with families. And when I say it's kind of like seasonal is because I was serving as an evaluator in Pennsylvania, which is something that's required for homeschoolers. They have a portfolio, and then I have to evaluate that portfolio.
Mhm.
Um, and for Pennsylvania, the law is a little strict per se. Um, but if I'm following exactly the law, basically each child just has to make sustained progress. They just have to make progress each year. There's no like guideline. They do take tests, but the tests aren't reported to anyone but me. So it's basically up to me to say, hey, your child has made progress, and then I'm gonna I certify your program. And then for you, is there anything that's concerning for you? Are there any anxieties that are coming up? And that's what led into my coaching.
Mm. I think most people who take this journey, any kind of coaching or can be really, really useful because when I started, like you said, I tried not to be stiff with the words of I didn't want to get stuck with. No, I used to get very anxious when somebody would, are you homeschooling? I would get anxious. No, I'm not homeschooling. Are you unschooling? I didn't like to be tagged or categorized into a homeschooling mom or a unschooling mom. I don't know. I used to get these jitters of being labeled into something. I don't know. I would rather prefer something like being a free learner, trying to learn everything that I can or that interests me. That gives me a more that doesn't seem very claustrophobic for me. Because if you try to put me in a box and say this is what you are doing, it's scary because I don't want to be something doing, being limited to something. And the same pattern I see in Adi. I wouldn't. He doesn't like to be he can change the next day. He can choose to learn something. That freedom I can see that he really, really needs to be able to learn or choose not to learn just to play. But we work constantly on, how we can plan and how we can, uh, uh, whatever we have decided, what plans we have, are we uh, able to do that the way we thought about it? We try to do all that kind of experiments in our learning. And I wanted to ask you, like, if I ask you how a day would look like for Kai, what would you say? What would you say to that?
I would say it kind of mirrors what you're saying. There's no day that's like there's no optimal day or there's no like stereotypical day for my son. It depends on the day of the week. You know, some days we go to meetups,
Mm,
and then other days are sometimes screen time heavy.
mm,
And it really depends on the day. But I think largely it's what he wants to get into. So whether it's a book to start off with, or well, I'll start here. When we wake up together, we'll eat breakfast together, my son and I, and then we try the best that we can to plan out our day. And that
mm,
means we talk about kind of the bullet points of what he wants to cover that day. And he might
mm,
say, I want to meet up with these two friends. I want to play Roblox with them. I want to do a podcast episode. We're currently working on a story together, this funny story about bunnies that it's just ridiculous. And so that might be in the mix.
mm,
And then he might say, like, I want to go outside and play some football,
mm,
uh, what have you. But then, just depending on the day of the week, we might be outside of the house for 5 hours at a meetup, just having fun
mm,
and complete free play with friends.
mm,
Um, and I'm one of the dads that I like to be active.
mm.
And so I'm often playing as well. If I'm not talking with the parents, I'm playing or climbing or doing something fun with the kids. Um, I think that's I think that's tricky for a lot of parents to think about like, well, how, especially when we're talking about self-directed learning, like how can I play in games without being like this overarching, like scary parent type. And it's really like, well, just consider everybody and make sure what you're doing is consensual, and then try to take everybody's needs into account.
Mm,
Um, and I think what's interesting, it's really beautiful what you're saying about how you you recognize that there's no like specific category that you're in. And I think that's a great place to be. But I think a lot of families start off trying to find the category or trying to fit a category. And I
Mm,
think for a lot of people, that's a necessary first step to say, like, okay, if it's unschooling and we're going to be unschoolers, then what specifically is unschooling? And let's try to do all of that.
mm, mhm,
And then after trying it out for a while, they're like, well, this part doesn't match us, or this part, we need a little bit more of this, or this doesn't work because of our, neurodivergence, or this doesn't work because of our temperament, or, what
mhm,
have you. And then that's where I think that's where the magic happens, like a bit of that individualization.
mm,
Um, and then you get to see like kind of the nuance of what life can be, pretty much.
mhm. Absolutely. I think it just gets very deep when you start thinking about it very seriously. So it's rather, just live a life where everything falls much into place, where you're quite involved with your kid. And I think some of us find deep joy in that, I'm sure. And it reflects when we talk to each other, we can find that. Anything that you would leave or like to say before we wrap up this talk? Would you like to say to parents who have been, I don't know, who want to do this or who want to understand a little bit more about what you are doing and how can they make a switch? What would you say?
That's a lot. That's a lot to put on my plate there. I would say learn about it, try it out, because the worst you can do is you can turn back, right? Hear stories about it. And I think that's one of the best things that helped me is to like, there's a website, it's called grownunschoolers.com, because I knew unschooling was a thing, but I didn't know what it looked like or if people were successful at the end of the road.
Mm,
And this just kind of gives a beautiful array of like what the possibilities are.
mm,
Um, and I also think there's a really beautiful moment, which I definitely touched in the last couple years, where my son has gotten to a point where he's the teacher now. Like he's definitely, I'm like, oh, trains, I trust my son understands this way better than I do. So I'll let him explain this now.
mm,
And that's a really cool place to arrive at. And I'm sure
mm.
you've met this
Oh
with your
God,
son as well.
I'm like
Yeah.
in so many things. I'm like, I don't know how this works. Like, I get stuck in so many things with technology, to be frank. And Adi is like, if he's not around, I'm like, how do I do this? And he's like, Ma, you can't figure this out yet. But
Uh,
it's my God, it's so many things here. Like, I have to look up to him and for advice and sometimes even conversations. I think there are times when um I start thinking aloud and he knows it. I don't know how. I think he makes it so easy. Otherwise, seriously, I wouldn't have known, to take some decisions.
It's beautiful. He's like not only part of your family, but he's part of your community, part of your
Yes,
health.
yes.
Yeah.
It's like, and you can just be loud and you can just talk about anything. Um, so, it's not like having someone, it's a very different kind of relationship. It's not just like telling him do this, do that, or oh my God, we are so away from those things, actually.
Mm.
We are more like doing things, together and figuring out what doesn't work, what works. So I think this is a relationship which, it helps you grow and nurture in a very beautiful way. You wouldn't have thought. Thank you, Dan, for being here. I think you helped me think so much about.
Good.
Well, generally, we don't think, we just keep doing things. So thank you for being here and enlightening us with, your story and your experiences. And I will share your link so that people can find you and reach out to you if they need. So thank you so much for being here. Nice talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.